Please be seated. I'll ask our jurors again, did you follow my instructions, not talk about the case among yourselves or with anybody else, or look up any of the people or places involved? Even if you did so inadvertently, now would be the time to raise your hand and let me know. For the record, no jurors lifted their hand. Defense, next witness.
Your Honor, defense rests.
Both the state and the defendant have now rested their case. The attorneys now will present their final arguments. Please remember that what the attorneys say is not evidence or your instruction on the law. However, do listen closely to their arguments. They are intended to aid you in understanding the case. Each side will have equal time, but the state is entitled to divide this time between an opening argument and a rebuttal argument after the defendant has spoken. State. Yes, sir.
Well, folks, I'm not going to say we've reached the end of. Can you hear me? I'll talk louder. I'm not going to say that we've reached the end of our journey because we've got a lot further to go. However, this is a crucial juncture in our case, the conclusion of the guilt phase. And like we discussed during jury selection, this is the guilt phase. You've heard guilt phase evidence, and at the conclusion of closing arguments, you're going to hear guilt phase law. If there is a penalty phase, you hear that law and that evidence later. So I have to ask you and refocus you that your purpose during this part of our trial is to determine what, if anything, Mr. Sievers is guilty of. So, marriage. That ever important covenant. That agreement among two people to love each other even when the other doesn't love them back. To stay together in sickness and in health, in good times and bad times. To forsake all others. That covenant, that agreement, that contract between two people also includes a clause not to kill your spouse. And the evidence has shown that Mr. Sievers has breached that contract. He's violated that contract. This is not a will or a trust. We heard a lot about that yesterday. This is a contract between two people, and it's been broken. The evidence has shown that Mark Sievers hired Curtis Wright, his best friend, to kill his wife, Dr. Teresa Sievers. An unconscionable act in light of that sacred contract between two married people. The first issue here, and I'm not even sure that it is an issue, is whether or not Teresa Sievers was murdered. Whether or not she was murdered as a result of a premeditated act. I don't think you're going to hear very much dispute about that in this case. Teresa Sievers was murdered, and her murder was planned. You heard uncontroverted evidence about that from Mr. Wright. He planned it.
Objection, Your Honor, may we approach? Okay.
So you've heard uncontroverted evidence from Mr. Wright about the plan to kill Dr. Teresa Sievers. So there's not really a question about that. The question is, the question that you have to answer based on the evidence, the question that we have to prove to you based on the evidence and based on the law, is whether or not Mark Sievers was a principal to the murder. And we're going to talk about principles in a minute. That's the first question. That's the first count. Murder. You're going to hear in the principle, you get to see the principal instruction. Mr. Sievers didn't even have to be present when the crime was committed. Let's talk first about murder. Murder. To prove the crime of first-degree murder, the state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant had a conscious intent for the criminal act to be done, and that the defendant did some act or said some word which was intended to, and which did incite, I'm reading the wrong instruction. To prove the crime of first-degree murder, premeditated murder, the state must prove the following three elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Teresa Sievers is dead. That's the first element. Okay, these are like ingredients in a recipe. I'm not trying to minimize the importance of this, but these are literally the ingredients that you put into a recipe for this crime. Teresa Sievers is dead. The death was caused by the criminal act of Mark Sievers. You'll actually hear an instruction from the court on what an act is. There was a premeditated killing of Teresa Sievers. Those are the ingredients. And without all three of those ingredients, you don't have premeditated murder. Those ingredients have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay? One of the elements of that ingredients, of that recipe, whether or not Mark Sievers committed a criminal act. I'm going to talk about that. Mark Sievers is a principal. He's a principal on two theories. The first theory is that Mark Sievers helped another person or persons commit a crime. And if he's done that, he's a principal that must be treated as if he had done all the things the other person did if, one, he had a conscious intent that the criminal act be done. Two, the defendant did some act or said some word which was intended to and which did incite, encourage, assist, or advise the other person or persons to actually commit the crime. To be a principal, the defendant does not even have to be present when the crime is committed. That's a powerful instruction. Okay? And that instruction, along with the next instruction on principles, should be your guide in determining whether or not Mark Sievers did an act in furtherance of this crime. If the defendant paid or promised, that's another contract that he breached. If he paid another person or persons to commit the crime, or promised to pay them, the defendant is a principal and must be treated as if he had done all of the things the person who was promised or received the money did if, one, the defendant had a conscious intent for the criminal act to be done, and two, he made or promised the payment in exchange for the commission or promised to commit the crime or to help commit the crime. And three, the crime was committed by Curtis Wayne Wright or Jimmy Rodgers. And again, to be a principal, the defendant does not have to be present when the crime is committed. So with reference to the actual murder of Dr. Sievers, you don't have to use time trying to figure out whether or not Mr. Sievers was directly involved and had his hands on Dr. Sievers during the death. It didn't happen. He wasn't there. He was in Connecticut. Don't use up your time trying to figure that part of it out. He wasn't there. He was with family. Okay? The question for you all to figure out, based on the evidence, is whether or not he's a principal. Okay? Promising payment. And as you're going to hear, you will likely hear, the only evidence of the contract to kill came from the contractor, right? A contract to kill is not like a will or a trust. They're not written down. You don't hire a board-certified lawyer to help you write a contract to kill, right? You don't want there to be evidence of that contract, right? So the primary evidence of that contract to kill is Curtis Wright. And the terms of that contract, the evidence of the terms of that contract can not only be explained by his words, but also by his actions. Why would Mr. Wright drive all the way down to Florida overnight with Jimmy Rodgers to kill Dr. Sievers? Why would he do that? You don't even have to judge his words about the contract. You can judge his actions. Money is a powerful motivator. Why would he do that? In fact, Mr. Wright was so broke that he needed an advance on the contract. He needed $600 to pay for the gas and the food that it was going to cost for him to come to Florida. And there's evidence of that in those texts between, counsel showed you one yesterday. You heard Mr. Wright tell you, finances weren't the best. Mr. Sievers is a principal because of that promise to pay. Mr. Sievers is a principal because he provided means for the murder. He provided alarm codes. That's an act of incitement or encouragement of assisting the murder. He provided the garage door code to Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright used those codes to enter the Sievers home to commit that heinous crime. How did Mr. Wright know that Dr. Sievers would be home alone? How did he know when she would be home? How did he know his target day was Sunday, June 28th? How did he know that she'd be home, even though he couldn't figure out the flight time, that she'd be home sometime around 11 o'clock Sunday night? How did he know? He knew because Mr. Sievers told him. That's another one of those words, acts. It's another one of those things that you do as a principal to a crime. But for that information, Mr. Wright would have had no clue when to be here. He would have had no clue when Dr. Sievers was arriving home. He wouldn't have known. Mr. Sievers also provided, for lack of a better word, intelligence information. How to get into the house, what door to use. Mr. Wright explained to you about that side garage door. It was a feature of his testimony that they jimmied open, or made it look like it was jimmied open, but it left the door unlocked. Okay, these aren't the, I guess you get what you pay for contract killers. You jimmy the door open to make it look like it's been jimmied open, but you leave the door unlocked. one of the things that well, I'm getting ahead of myself. But these are the reasons why Mr. Sievers is a principal: promising payment, alarm codes, providing date and time, providing intelligence information about the information. And then you also have the discussion, which is corroborated by the actual text messages that have been the subject of testimony from multiple witnesses, about how Mr. Sievers wanted Mr. Wright to obtain a burner phone. That's also an act in furtherance, not just of the conspiracy, but of being a principal. Go and get this phone so we can use them to plan this murder. Okay? So we heard about, from Mr. Wright, about how Mr. Sievers was explaining to him how the backyard was laid out, talking to him about the fence in the backyard, about the shrubs. Remember that testimony? Then you heard from Ms. Torres. Ms. Torres is well established. She likes to talk to the press. But what you heard from her was Mr. Sievers was in the back of her house, where he's not supposed to be. She actually pointed to you. He's back here on her lanai. Why is he back there? Because the garage door is over here. The garage door that Mr. Sievers was telling Mr. Wright to use, make it look like a burglary, was over here. So here's Miss Torres's bedroom window here, and the bedroom door, which is on the lanai here, and here is the garage door. Can't she see it? Can't she tell if anybody's there? The only way to find out is to go and get the vantage point himself. That's not something Mr. Wright told you. That's not something Miss Showmaker told you. That's not something Lebed and Downs told you. That's something Miss Torres told you, somebody who lives next door to the Sievers, who's not getting anything in exchange for her testimony. So they use these burner phones for secret communications. This is message May 7th at 3:45:24 p.m. UTC -4. Since neither one of us are likely to carry both with us, whenever you want, just use the other one. Just text me other, and then when I can, I will call. That is from the defendant. What's the big secret? Why does there have to be a code to use other phones? If this is a legitimate purpose, if there's a legitimate reason to use, I'm not even going to say burner phone, I'll say disposable phone. Why not just say, hey, when we need to talk about this legitimate thing, call me on the track phone. Call me on my track phone. If everything's on the up and up, why does there have to be a code? Why? Why does there have to be a code? Then, on May 17th, from Mr. Wright to Mr. Sievers, clearly Mr. Wright got the message, check other. Check other. Mr. Wright responds, or Mr. Sievers responds, hello, brother, from an other, quote, other, unquote, mother. That's Mr. Sievers speaking. Again, if everything is copacetic, if there's no crime being committed, if there's no conspiracy being committed, why? Why the coded messages? Why? There's no need for it. From Mr. Sievers, May 17th at 21:56 UTC -5. K, other, whenever you want now. Those are in evidence. You can read them along with the other messages in the exhibits. This is not just the evidence. These burner phones and conversations are not just evidence of the principle of Mr. Sievers being a principal in the first-degree murder of Dr. Teresa Sievers. They're also evidence of the conspiracy. And we're going to talk about conspiracy later on, but conspiracy is an interesting crime because it's consummated when you make the agreement to commit the crime. So even if Dr. Sievers had somehow been able to thwart her own murder, if she had not come home, or she had been able to arm herself and dispatch her intruders, the conspiracy was still committed when the agreement was made. So you can have a conspiracy to commit a murder even if the murder doesn't happen. You can have a conspiracy, you could be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that there was a conspiracy, and you could still have a reasonable doubt that there was a murder, in theory. So these text messages are evidence of both crimes. This message, May 22nd, 8:50 p.m. UTC -4, to Wayne Wright from Mark Sievers. Do you think we can talk a little tonight? Just need 3 minutes. Setting static IP, T-home, quote, other, unquote, then changing. What does that even mean? Part of it is computer lingo, static IPs, T-home, T must mean Teresa. What does that mean? It means call me on my burner phone. That's what it means. (6:24:15). 11 p.m. UTC -4. To Mr. Wright from Mr. Sievers. I will dispose of outdated computer tomorrow after erasing everything from its memory and then remove hard drive as well. Now before that, they had been talking about VPN, virtual private networks. Mr. Wright told you that was a real conversation. They were talking about VPN for the office. But he also explained this message here was a coded message from Mr. Sievers that the burner phone was being destroyed. And lo and behold, you see in the burner phone records, no more calls. That burner phone ceased to exist. Again, more evidence of the conspiracy, more evidence of the acts that were committed in furtherance of the conspiracy. In the text message conversations that admitted into evidence, you'll see this message. And the question marks mean just that. What? To Mr. Wright, can hardly wait. This is May 7th, 10:42 p.m. UTC -4. This is, again, after the conspiracy started. Okay, or the same day of the conspiracy, of the agreement being made. Mr. Sievers says to Mr. Wright, for my trip to St. Louis this summer with Josie and Carmi. My trip. My trip this summer with Josie and Carmi. Not Josie, Carmi, and Teresa. Not our trip. His trip to St. Louis with his daughters. Wasn't making plans for the future. These two men, you'll see in the records, They text each other about anything and everything. Yesterday you heard discussions about what they sleep in. You'll see text messages in there, good morning, sunshine. They text each other just to say good morning. They talked about family, they talked about business, almost every day, right? They talked about a lot. And that's what you would expect from two best friends, from two lifelong friends. You share every day, even when you're separated by 1,100 miles. That's what you expect. So you expect daily communication. June 24th. All kinds of discussion on their regular phones. Back and forth, back and forth. Text messages, you get to see them, you have them. They're going to go to the jury room with you. June 25th. Text messages, phone calls, back and forth. Voicemails, back and forth, all day. Again, because these two guys are best friends. That's what best friends do. June 25th, what? 26th, rather. Now, this was also the day that the Sievers family was flying to New York, right? The Friday. I believe it was Friday. Only a text message between both phones. Early in the morning. And then June 27th. This is the day Mr. Sievers, or Mr. Wright, was on his way to Florida. There are a bunch of unanswered phone calls here because Mr. Wright explained to you that he left his regular phone in Missouri. And he traveled to Florida with his burner phone. So you've got an unanswered phone call from Mr. Sievers, and then you got this text message here. No need to call me. Hope you're having a nice day. Okay. Again, these two guys, they talk about everything and anything. Almost every day. And if you go through the records, you see there were some days when they didn't talk, at least not on these phones. You go through the records of both of their regular phones, but it was very rare. Days like June 28th are very rare. No discussion? June 28th? Not a single phone call, ladies and gentlemen. Not a good morning, sunshine. How are you doing? How does this computer work? Help me with this fax modem. Guess what we did when we were in New York? Guess what Dr. Sievers' family member said to me? The kind of things that best friends commiserate about, right? When you're spending time with in-laws, all right? Y'all know what I'm talking about. Not a single discussion on June 28th. Why? Because Mr. Sievers knew where Mr. Wright was, and he knew what he was doing. There was no need to talk on the 28th. That's why. That's why. June 29th. This is the day, let's assume for a minute that our allegation against Mr. Sievers is completely incorrect. Let's give that what you're supposed to give that assumption until we prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. But assuming that he remains innocent, this is the day that Mr. Sievers found out that his wife was killed. Right? And you heard from Miss Bardelli that she got a call from Mr. Sievers. And she was in Fort Myers within 24 hours. Right? You heard from Dr. Mitchell. She got notified. She was on her way to Fort Myers. But Mr. Sievers didn't call his best friend, his lifelong friend, the person that he talks to about what he sleeps in. The person who they text to say, "Good morning, sunshine." He doesn't call and tell his best friend, "Something horrible has happened to my wife. I need you." He doesn't text him, "I need you in Fort Myers." Isn't that what best friends do? They come to the rescue, right? That's what they do. Something horrible happens, you call the people closest to you and you tell them what happened and you ask for their support. You don't even have to ask when a person is a true friend, right? Instead, Mr. Wright hears from Scott Sievers the next day. And, Mr. Wright explained he knew what he did it. He did it. He knew what happened. But Mr. Sievers set up his brother to notify Mr. Wright. It's part of the setup. Again, you look at the behavior. Look at the text messages. The text messages by themselves are not the word. They are the words of the defendant. They also are evidence of his behavior. And they are corroborative of Mr. Wright's testimony. So, I don't know why that slide's still in there. This is a chain conspiracy. This is what happens when you stay up too late. This is a chain conspiracy, okay? This is a conspiracy where people can have a common motive, a common objective, but they don't have to talk to each other to be involved in a conspiracy. And you're going to hear that in the jury instruction. So what you have here is Mr. Sievers engages Mr. Wright in a conspiracy to commit murder. Mr. Wright engages Mr. Rodgers in the conspiracy. And all three men have the common objective of the conspiracy, which is to commit murder. Even if there were 20 more people on this line, on this chart, they don't all have to have spoken to one another as long as they're involved in the common plan to commit murder. The common plan being orchestrated by Mr. Wright. That's what a chain conspiracy is. Some people call it a chain conspiracy. They call it a line conspiracy. And the reason why is because it's a linear conspiracy. Not everybody in here knows everybody else. Not everybody in the conspiracy necessarily knows everybody's role. But they all have a common plan: murder. To prove the crime of criminal conspiracy, the state must prove the following two elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Again, these are ingredients in the recipe for a conspiracy. One, the intent of Mark Sievers was that the offense of murder would be committed. Two, in order to carry out the intent, Mark Sievers agreed, conspired, or confederated with Jimmy Rodgers and Curtis Wright to cause the murder to be committed either by them or one of them or by some other person. It is not necessary that the agreement, conspiracy, combination, confederation to commit murder be expressed in any particular words, or that the words pass between the conspirators. It is not necessary that the defendant do any act in furtherance of the conspiracy. That's the law, folks. That's conspiracy. Those are the elements that the state has proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt. So Mr. Wright is a felon. He's an admitted liar. He's a killer. by himself, there's no reason why any reasonable person should believe a word he says. But he's corroborated by evidence. He's corroborated. He says there was an agreement to use burner phones. Guess what? The sheriff's office found evidence of burner phones. Those burner phones corroborated Curtis Wright's testimony. His burner phone is pinging off the tower by his house, right next to his house. You have that picture. You'll get to see it when you deliberate. There's a tower right next to his house. His burner phone is also following him around Missouri with his regular phone. Mr. Sievers' burner phone from the Walmart down on Juliet Boulevard in Naples, where he's been to, because there are receipts from that Walmart and evidence, follows him around Bonita Springs. Pings on the very same tower of his house, of his regular phone, rather. Never leaves Lee County, and then mysteriously disappears on or about June 24th. That's corroboration. Curtis Wright doesn't have to tell you that. That's AT&T telling you that. That's investigative techniques telling you that. That's Myra Simmons telling you that. No evidence of her being felon. No evidence of her being a paid informant or a suggestion that she's a paid informant. She's retired. She's here on her own time. You can consider that as well. There's an agreement based on life insurance payments. How did Mr. Wright know that the girls would be well taken care of? That's what Mr. Wright said. That's the same thing Miss Baradelli told you that Mr. Sievers said to her. The girls would be well taken care of. How is it that they both use the same descriptive language in describing a conversation with Mark Sievers? That's also corroborative evidence. Corroborative evidence of the words said by Mark Sievers. Mr. Wright says he came to Florida to kill Dr. Sievers with Jimmy Rodgers. There's evidence of that. Corroborative evidence. The jumpsuit. And Jimmy Rodgers' actions in tossing a jumpsuit out the window along a roadway in Missouri, telling his girlfriend to throw it in the river or throw it in the water under the bridge. That's an act of a guilty conscience. That's an act of a person destroying evidence who doesn't want to be caught. Corroborative evidence. Mr. Wright told you he drove down here in a white, rented, maybe he didn't say white. He said a rented Hyundai Elantra. Well, you have pictures of the white Hyundai Elantra that Sheriff's Office found in Arizona. You also have video of it being driven by Mr. Wright to the gas station up in Brooksville. That video isn't an informant. That video is not an admitted liar or a felon. It is. The fibers from the jumpsuit that are recovered from the back of Dr. Sievers' dress, as well as the back of her leg. Mr. Wright told you that he and Mr. Rodgers suited up, went into that house, and waited for Dr. Sievers to come home so they could kill her. When she came home, she fought for her life against two men and two hammers. A fight she couldn't win, but she fought. He said they wore suits that Mr. Rodgers got from his job. Well, those blue fibers on her dress are corroborative of his testimony. Those blue fibers aren't, they're witnesses, but they're not paid informants. They're not snitches. They're not convicted felons or admitted liars. And the expert witness who testified to you about what those fibers mean, the lady from the FBI, Miss Otterstatter, no evidence that she's a paid informant or any other issue. Corroborative evidence of Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright told you that he got here early, got to Fort Myers early because he didn't know what the traffic situation would be between Fort Myers and Missouri. He wanted to be here, he wanted to be in place and be ready for Dr. Sievers' arrival. They actually got here and had time to spare. So he went to Walmart. Jimmy wanted some, he said Jimmy wanted some stuff for the beach. He also bought wet wipes that were later used to clean up the scene. Bought an extra pair of shoes. And you'll see in the Walmart video, Ms. Ross introduced a photograph of a pair of black sneakers in Missouri that was found at Mr. Rodgers' house. Black sneakers that had a white sole on them. And you see in the Walmart video, you see Mr. Rodgers walking into the Walmart wearing those black shoes with the white sole on them. A little design on the side. But in the Brooksville video, he's wearing different shoes. They're all black. They don't have a white sole on them. Again, corroborative evidence. Mr. Wright says he went to Walmart. Man, there's a video of him in Walmart. Mr. Wright says they stopped for gas. One of the things that he told you was, on the way back, they needed to stop, and he punched in a search into the Garmin to find a gas station. And you heard from Mr. DeShazo and Mr. Lacombe, they found a search in the Garmin for a gas station. At the coordinates, approximately, Mr. Wright told you he's not familiar with Florida, but he knows he was on his way back to Missouri and he was north of Fort Myers. Corroborative evidence. That Garmin unit has nothing to gain in this trial. It's just a dumb device that does what we tell it to. And Mr. DeShazo and Mr. Lacombe are digital forensics technicians who work for the sheriff's office. Again, corroborative evidence. Mr. Wright says that there was an agreement between him, a gentleman's agreement, again, another unwritten contract between him and his best friend, Mr. Sievers, for $100 a month, $100 a month for Mr. Wright to assist with the computer servers at Dr. Sievers' medical practice. And you saw the checks that went into evidence. There was an extra check, though. There was some extra money. Mr. Wright told you that he told Mr. Sievers he didn't have money for the trip. The trip to come down here to kill Mr. Sievers' wife. And so Mr. Sievers, using the medical practice as cover, sent a $600 check to Missouri that Mr. Wright cashed, and that's what he used to feed himself and Mr. Rodgers during the trip, as well as to feed the Elantra in gasoline, and also to buy that stuff at Walmart. The check is corroborative evidence. You heard some cross-examination yesterday with or direct examination actually, where Mr. Rodgers was asked about a text message sent to him by Mr. Sievers. Mr. Sievers says, I would like to pay you $2,000, $2K for 10 months. Mr. Rodgers was emphatic that that wasn't the agreement. The agreement was $100. Mr. Rodgers told you that in the past, Dr. Sievers had provided him with some help with a medical situation. You also heard corroboration of that from Dr. Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell knew about it. Again, corroboration. Now, Mr. Wright's testimony wasn't perfect, right? Where is the second hammer? He doesn't know. But if he's some criminal mastermind, if he's part of some big frame-up, why didn't he tell you that he knew where it was? Why not just say, you know, I saw Jimmy throw it in the river on the way back to Missouri? There would have been no way to dispute that or prove it, or even find the river. I think you cross two rivers just between here and Punta Gorda. If this is a frame-up, why does Mr. Rodgers still have his jumpsuit? Mr. Wright couldn't explain that. Why not? If this is a frame-up of his best friend who he texts with just about every day, why not have an explanation for it? Why not make something up? It's not perfect. If this is a frame-up, and if Mr. Wright can't be completely believed, if that's the case, then why didn't he have an answer for where Mr. Rodgers was when Dr. Sievers came home? There would have been no way for us to prove or disprove if he said, oh, Mr. Rodgers was standing right next to me in the garage when that door started going up and we both dove on the ground behind the car. Unless Mr. Rodgers comes in here, there would have been no way for us to prove or disprove that. He could have made something up. Right? Why didn't he? Why didn't he have an answer for all of the questions? Why wasn't he pristine? Why wasn't he perfect? This is some kind of frame-up. Did Mr. Rodgers hit Dr. Sievers with the claw of the hammer that final time? Mr. Wright says he did. The medical examiner says he didn't. Why not make something up about that? Why not? Does it matter in the whole big scheme of how Dr. Sievers died, whether or not she was hit with a claw or not? She was killed as a result of a premeditated murder by two men who lied in wait in her house for her to come home. So if this is a frame job, why isn't Mr. Wright perfect? Why doesn't he have all of the answers? That's what you should expect from a frame job. Let's talk about Mr. Sievers' behavior. Mr. Sievers spent a lot of money. The Sievers family spent a lot of money on life insurance payments. They got advice from a board-certified expert in trusts. Not easy to get an LLM from University of Florida. Not easy to get board certified by the Florida Bar. Isn't that something that Mr. Sievers would remember when he has that discussion with Miss Baradelli the night she arrives in Fort Myers? How did he forget all the work that he and Dr. Sievers did to get life insurance. He's talking to Miss Baradelli, had talked to her about her being a guardian, and you also see her name on that irrevocable trust that went into evidence during the defense case as one of the contingent trustees. So he remembers that she's a guardian, a potential guardian for the daughters, but doesn't remember life insurance? Oh, by the way, that's right, I forgot, we have life insurance. Come on. From day one, Mr. Sievers was arrested. From day one, Mr. Sievers was concerned he would be arrested. That's what Ms. Baradelli told you. Why would this husband and father, who was out of town when his wife was killed, be so concerned? Then, when he found out that Mr. Wright had been arrested, he was concerned that Mr. Wright would say something about him. Why? If you are the innocent, loving husband who was out of town and your wife was brutally murdered, then why would you be concerned that your best friend would accuse you of her murder or being involved in her murder? Why? So that's consciousness of guilt. He was afraid he'd get caught. And the only person who could help him get caught is Mr. Wright. That's why. He's not upset with Mr. Wright after Mr. Wright is arrested. Okay, well, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. He's in denial about his best friend being arrested for killing his wife, right? The same best friend who he didn't call himself to say that his wife was killed, right? So he's such a best friend that he can't believe that he's killed Dr. Sievers, but he's not best friend of enough to be one of the very first people who get called when she's found dead. Okay, so he's not upset. Why isn't he asking that big W word, the one I keep repeating to you? Why is my best friend under arrest for killing my wife? I want to know what's going on. No, he says the opposite of that. They're just trying to get to me through my friends. They're just trying to take shortcuts. This is what he told Ms. Baradelli. This is what he told Dr. Mitchell. You can rely on your memories of what they said. He does the very opposite of what you would expect a person to do when a man who you know is arrested for killing your wife. He wasn't inquisitive. He made excuses. Told Dr. Petritis didn't know Jimmy Rodgers. Told Dr. Mitchell he didn't know Jimmy Rodgers. Told Miss Baradelli he didn't know Jimmy Rodgers. But they were associating at the Wright wedding. And take a look at those text messages that went into evidence. When Mr. Wright, in May, I think it's May, tells Mr. Sievers, we got to go help Jimmy's girlfriend move. I was out helping Jimmy's girlfriend move. Mr. Wright told you that even though Mr. Sievers had never met Jimmy Rodgers, he knew who he was. They socialized at the party. We're not suggesting to you that Mr. Sievers and Mr. Rodgers were friends. We're not There's no suggestion there. We're not making that suggestion. We're not even suggesting that Mr. Sievers and Mr. Rodgers had direct contact about this plot to kill. That's not what we're telling you. We're telling you that when Mr. Sievers tells Dr. Petritis and Dr. Mitchell and Ms. Baradelli that he didn't know Jimmy Rodgers, that it was untruthful. That's what we're telling you. And it was untruthful because of, again, of that consciousness of guilt. Okay, fine. He doesn't want to be mad about his best friend being arrested for killing his wife. Why isn't he mad about this Jimmy Rodgers guy who he barely knows for being arrested for killing his wife? Why doesn't he want to ask why? Why is Jimmy Rodgers accused of killing my wife? He knows why. We heard that Mr. Sievers criticized the Lee County Sheriff's detectives who took months to investigate this case, to find the person who killed his wife. Criticized them and was more angry with them than he was with the two people who were under arrest for doing it. You also heard from Dr. Petritis. Clearly, he had to have had an air of urgency in his voice when he told Mr. Sievers, Teresa's hurt. You need to get back here. Now, under that covenant of marriage that we talked about at the beginning of the closing of my closing, that covenant of marriage, that agreement, that contract requires the spouse to ask, can I speak to her? How did she get hurt? What happened to her? Oh, you called 911? You've called them? What hospital is she going to go to? He didn't ask. He didn't ask because he knew. She wasn't going to a hospital, and she was more than just hurt. That's why he didn't ask. Why is the voicemail and phone call to Dr. Petritis the Sunday before Dr. Sievers is killed, while Mr. Sievers is still in Connecticut, important? Because he needed to make sure his puzzle pieces were in place for what was going to happen on Monday. He needed to make sure Dr. Petritis would be home, because that's the person who was going to get called to go find Dr. Sievers. That's why. Dr. Petritis told you it was unusual to get that kind of a message from Mr. Sievers, a kind of a phone call from Mr. Sievers. That doesn't happen regularly. That's why the phone call. So if Mr. Sievers is innocent and the death of his wife was a surprise, why did Scott Sievers, not Dr. Scott Sievers, why did Mr. Scott Sievers have to deliver the news to Mr. Wright? So, as you begin your deliberations, you're going to have to put the pieces of the puzzle together that Ms. Ross told you about in her opening statement. The pieces of the puzzle to this investigation. Finding the existence of a crime beyond a reasonable doubt requires you not to examine each individual piece of the puzzle. Each individual piece of the puzzle will never convince a reasonable jury beyond a reasonable doubt, maybe. But the whole purpose of sitting here for all this time and listening to all these witnesses and getting all this instruction of the law is for the jury to put the pieces to the puzzle together. And then once they have a full picture of what happened, to make that decision on whether they are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt is a doubt to which you can attach a reason. Reasonable doubt is not speculative, imagined, or forced. So, the pieces to the puzzle, and there's a whole bunch of them. I'm going to show you 6 here off the top of my head. The recon mission, I call it the recon mission, over to Ms. Torres's house. That's a piece to the puzzle. The text messages between Mr. Rodgers and Mr. Sievers, Mr. Wright and Mr. Sievers. That's a piece to the puzzle. The burner phones and location data that go with them. That's a piece in the puzzle. The testimony of Mr. Wright, the co-defendant. That's a piece of the puzzle. Mr. Sievers' behavior during this investigation is a piece of the puzzle. And the existence of the insurance policies, pieces to the puzzle. The only board-certified expert in insurance was Attorney Lyons, not Mr. Sievers. So as you go back to the jury room to deliberate, you have a whole bunch of consideration to give. Don't consider any sympathy for the defendant. If you disagree with the law, the jury room is not the appropriate place to voice that disagreement. You must follow the law as it is set out in the instructions that you'll be given. If you don't like the law that you hear, when you're done giving due consideration to the law, you call Tallahassee and you tell somebody you don't like the law. You don't change the law in the jury room. You can't consider conjecture. During the guilt phase, your mission is to consider the evidence of guilt. If there is a penalty phase, that'll be the appropriate time to consider the penalty. You can't consider prejudice, sentiment, public feeling, public opinion, or passion during your deliberations. You have to consider documents that have gone into evidence. You'll get to take them all back to the jury room. You may not be able to take, for example, the biohazard stuff. You can come out and ask to see it. Can't necessarily take that back there. The court will give you an instruction on what you can take back and what you can't. But everything that you saw admitted in evidence, every disc, every flash drive, every piece of paper, every photo, every jumpsuit, everything, you have the right to see. You consider the testimony of the witnesses, the credibility of the witnesses, photographs. Why wouldn't Ms. Lyons give Ms. Ross clear answers to her questions yesterday? You're going to hear an instruction on rules for deliberation, on considering the credibility of the witnesses. Why was it such a struggle for Ms. Ross to get some very simple answers to questions about a document Ms. Lyons wrote? She wrote the document. The expert. Maybe she has an interest in how this case should be decided. The elements of the crime. And we've gone over the elements. You'll hear the more complete elements when the court gives you the instructions. Folks, this will be my final opportunity to to talk to you. You'll get to hear later on from Ms. Ross. But as I yield and turn the floor over to the defense, I want you to consider asking why. I want you to keep asking why. Why would Mr. Wright act on his own with Jimmy Rodgers to do this? Why? Why is Dr. Sievers dead? Why is she dead? She's not a criminal. She's not a captain of industry. She's not a politician. She's not some crime syndicate kingpin. She's a medical doctor and a mother of two and a wife. And she's dead. Why? I thank you for your attention and your continued attention as we move forward. And at the end of your deliberations, I'm going to thank you for your verdict of guilty of first-degree murder and your verdict of guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Thank you.
Jurors, okay to continue? I see a few hands, so we'll take a quick restroom break. I'm going to instruct you not to talk about the case among yourselves or with anybody else or look up any of the people or places involved. And as soon as we're done with the restroom, we'll continue. This for about 5 minutes.